Has it been a good week? Are you enjoying camp? We have absolutely loved it. Camp with a baby, I have been told, is the easiest camp I will ever have as a parent. Before they crawl and run and roll in the mud. Ross, we have so appreciated hearing your presentations this week. Thank you. I don't know about you, I've been encouraged in reminding myself the science that backs up everything that I've always intrinsically known works best. And what the Bible supports, what the spirit of prophecy supports. We know that our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. We know that there are health evangelistic ministries within our churches, and I do encourage you to plug into some of those opportunities. There are extensive Bible studies out there on the health message. And we know that God says, cast all your cares upon him as we talk about stress and anxiety today, for he cares for you. Never once in the Bible does it say to stress or worry. But 365 times it is recorded, do not be afraid. One for every single day of the year. Before we give the microphone over to Ross, let me read to you from Jeremiah chapter 17. This is from verses 7 and 8. Blessed are those who
news about work or some other financial issue, that's a stress. It's a stressor and it's easily attachable to something, and we feel stressed. If you have a look at anxiety, anxiety is actually more something which is an anticipation. And this is where particularly our society is getting more anxious. And I remember I had a PhD student who was a psychologist and doing some of the neurosciences, particularly around, and we were looking at postnatal depression particularly, and building up a model for how that might fit and why some people were susceptible to others. But we were also adding into that this concept of anxiety. So anxiety is something where you are anticipating the stress, but it hasn't actually happened. There hasn't actually necessarily been a trigger. Now, I want full disclosure here. I'm a scientist, particularly a neuroscientist. Lots of ways to describe me, but when it comes to the neuroscience, I feel comfortable. In terms of the psychology, I get experts to help me. And I've actually had a colleague of mine who is a psychologist who I actually wanted to present today. Not an Adventist, and unfortunately had something else that they needed to do, but I thought they would have done a particularly good job. But we certainly discussed it. So it has been vetted, but I'm hoping that I at least keep faithful to at least the science within psychology as well. So anxiety, as I said, differs from stress. Stress is actually brought on by an immediate or some kind of genuine stressor that's actually there. Anxiety actually is something where we're waiting for something bad to happen, some kind of perceived threat. And it does seem that anxiety, this concept of anxiety, is going up in society, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So anxiety, somewhat future-orientated. Something bad is going to happen. I will lose my money. I will lose my health. Something will happen to my children, etc. Whereas stress itself, short-lived, identifiable. So there are a number of common anxiety disorders, not that we're going to deal with any of these, just to bring context. It was easiest to get these from the American Psychiatric Association. We do have some figures for Australia, but I'm not spending a lot of time on this, but roughly we'll be the same. As Ty Gibson was trying to tell us, we're essentially the same population except in different countries geographically. I'm not sure I 100% agree with that, but I think we are certainly tracking very close to the US. So specific phobias, somebody's just got an unusual dislike or concern. We all know about phobias. It's almost 1 in 10 people, or around about, on average, 1 in 10 people. Social anxiety disorder, so really having trouble in being engaged in large groups. Panic disorders, those type of things coming on. And all of us, to some extent, can experience a panic disorder, and that kind of fits more with what we will call a trait anxiety, which I'll talk more about later on. Agoraphobia is just having a fear of something, and 1 to 1.7, so 1 in 100, nearly 2 in 100 people. Generalized anxiety disorder, and that's probably one of the more common ones, and that is you're just feeling anxious all of the time, and that certainly is going up. Separation anxiety disorder. Yeah, look, I won't go into some of the background for that, but we may be setting our society up for more of that kind of problem. Selective mutism, you just can't speak the word. Now, all of us get tongue-tied for something, and in some cases where we are feeling a little bit stressed and we just can't get the words out, but this is particularly severe, so people just literally can't talk. Now, women are more likely than men to experience anxiety disorders, and as I put up some of the statistics earlier on in the week, and you saw when it comes to the top 10 causes of disease, or top 10 causes of death in Australia, we are the only country where, as far as I'm aware, women dying from, our number one cause of death for women is actually the dementias. And for men, it's actually number 2. And as far as I'm aware, the statistics that I've seen across the world, I think we are the only country where that's the case. And we don't know why that's happening. But maybe it is tied also in with anxiety. And we certainly have, there is a link between anxiety, stress, and the development of the neurodegeneratives. So most people who experience anxiety do not have a diagnosable anxiety disorder. All of us are going to experience anxiety over something for a short period of time, and there can be, significant triggers and reasons why that might happen. But if it is continuing, then it may be diagnosable. If you really want if you want to go and test yourself, there is an online anxiety assessment where you can actually just tap in and do some of the online questions and see whether or not that's actually the case. It's interesting in my own case, I would never have thought that I had any anxiety issues. And particularly as a male, and you saw my hand go on my hip, definitely it won't happen to me. But what is interesting, and I grew up in a home where our father particularly was quite an angry person. Some would call it violent. And you were constantly on edge. And there are certain things, it was my wife that picked it up after we'd been married a number of years, and I would get a certain breathlessness where I couldn't actually take a deep breath. And I remember that had happened actually over a number of years. My father had even taken me along to different specialists to try and work out what it was, thinking it was pleurisy or something like that. And it turns out it's actually anxiety related. And so if things are getting too much pressure for me, I'll actually have that breathlessness where I actually can't take a proper breath, and it's quite distressing. But I never would have thought psychologically I'm not feeling as if I can't cope. But my body is actually feeling anxious. So surprisingly enough, I fit into one of those categories, potentially. So this is this idea of state and trait anxiety. Now, I won't talk much about epigenetics, but you're all aware that you can be imprinted in a certain way with the epigenetics. So as both in utero as well as in early developmental years, if you're in an environment which is stressful, and the parent, especially the mum during pregnancy, third trimester particularly when the brain is developing most, you can actually imprint the child for actually being what we would call a trait anxiety. So epigenetically, they're actually switched on so that they're hypervigilant. And I would certainly fit into that category. I am hypervigilant from a psychological point of view. State anxiety is where we actually feel anxious in the moment, or if you like, it's circumstances, some sort of triggers, anticipation of a threat. Whereas on the other hand, you've got trait anxiety, which is something where you have a predisposition for anxiety. Your threshold for feeling anxiety is actually a lot lower than some people. You'll feel it a bit earlier. And it can be different even for people in the same family. So state and trait anxiety, not mutually exclusive. Of course, you can have a trait anxiety where you're not necessarily stressed, not necessarily feeling anxiety, though you've got the trait. Though it won't take much to push you over the edge, and then that becomes a state anxiety. So trait feeding into state. So while anxiety per se is not a pathological state, as it can prevent exposure to dangerous situations, and that's the whole purpose of being anxious about something. Just something's tweaked, and something goes, there's a problem here, or could be a problem here. Now, my wife has a fairly sensitive, fairly low threshold, perceives threats in all sorts of ways, particularly when I'm driving. Who would have thought? I mean, I drive and I drive in a way which I consider to be an aware driver. So I'm not expecting people to know where I am, but I know where they are, and that's why I whiz past them as quick as possible. I remember when we were in Africa, actually, that we had a ute, four-wheel drive ute, and I used to have to drive between one hospital, which was at Malamulo, this is in Malawi, and from Malamulo, which is out at Makwasa, through into Blantyre, the main centre. There was another hospital in there. And it's about a 70-kilometre trip. And it's only, at the time, I understand the road is a lot better now, but at the time it was just a single lane. And you would often meet, there were tea estates and banana plantations in different places, and you would often meet these very large trucks coming along there. There was really only room for one small car, and now you've got a big truck coming along. In addition to that, anytime you're getting anywhere close to a village, there's chickens and people and children running everywhere, and nobody pays much attention to the traffic. And I remember thinking to myself, as we're driving along there the first time, I don't know how anybody could travel more than about maybe 50 or 60 kilometres an hour along this road. By the time I had finished there, and we were in Malawi for 3 years, I was doing that road at about 110, 120. Absolutely just flat out. And I wonder why Carilda chose not to sit in the front with me anymore, but to actually sit in the back, like in the back of the ute, facing the opposite way. So I'm going, Carilda, I've never hit anything yet. But anyway, she felt that there was cause for anxiety within that, and probably justifiable. It's interesting, and I'm going to join these two together because we can't talk about them a lot separately. But the neurobiology of stress and anxiety are similar. They are actually slightly different, but they're similar. So I'm going to bring them together. I don't have to tell you much about. Look, there's a bunch of different things in here, and I've mentioned all the different parts of the brain that are involved, but it doesn't really impact an awful lot on what we're going to do this morning, except to say that between anxiety and stress, there's a lot of similarities. The only difference is that anxiety, and particularly not anxiety just for a short period of time, but people who are constantly anxious or very regularly anxious, there's a chronic element to it. And so whereas stress puts up things like cortisol and the stress hormones, noradrenaline, adrenaline, and the body sort of just goes up, responds to those and drops back. In the case of anxiety where you've got it the whole time, you're still producing those stress hormones, but the body is actually becoming adapted to them. So in actual fact, instead of it actually suppressing the immune system in that way, it can actually start to stimulate the immune system, so you actually end up in a more inflammatory state. Does that make sense? And unfortunately, being in an inflammatory state is not ideal. Part of that, though, I won't go into any of this at all, but part of it is actually because you're also producing some of those hormones like noradrenaline and adrenaline. And what they do, and particularly things like noradrenaline, it can actually damage the blood vessels. So you're actually having that constantly, and so the blood vessels themselves, what we call the endothelium, they're the cells that actually line the arteries, they can actually become damaged, and that plays into things like increasing blood pressure, unfortunately developing things like atherosclerosis, particularly the soft plaque. So I won't go much more into that, but I'm just saying here at the last one, the similarity in the neural circuits controlling both stress and anxiety suggests treatment targets targeting these neural pathways can be the same or effective across both. So there's quite similar, slightly different just from a sort of purist point of view, but similar. So what causes stress and anxiety? Not all adverse or demanding circumstances cause stress, and it's true. Sometimes it's just a negative event and you get to solve, or demanding situation, you can handle it and move on. What might be stressful for one person might not be stressful for somebody else. So stress arises, and it's good to kind of appreciate this, from our perceived inability to solve the apparent problem. Now, there's a certain level of stress that I have standing up in front here, and particularly with this talk, which is kind of little, it's stretching me a little bit. I've had PhD students in the area of psychology. We've worked in it. I've talked about it, but I'm not a psychologist. So as a neuroscientist, I'm kind of conscious of the fact that I've got to be careful I don't stretch too far along there. So there's a little bit of more anxiety normally than if you just got me talking about the clinical biochemistry. I'm very comfortable with that and the neurochemistry. So a little bit of that. So stress arises from a perceived inability to solve the apparent problem. Not all people feel stress for the same level, for the same situation. You would all know that. Some people deal with things just so easily, and other people it's taking them a little longer. Incidentally, when you're solving a problem, which part of the brain are you using? Mostly frontal lobe. Now, you do reference to different parts of the brain, but it's the frontal lobe that are actually doing the discriminating and the thinking. I don't know that I've mentioned, and look, I'm going to be really honest. I had no intention of spending any time really on this issue of caffeine. And I know I've mentioned it a few times, but it just kind of pops into my head, and I'm thinking, you need to explain that. So, okay, I'll explain that then. But it's just interesting. Remember that I said that the frontal lobes, when you take caffeine, and it actually affects middle age and above more than it does young people, but on both, it actually reduces blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. So it's reducing blood flow to the very parts of the brain that are actually problem solving. Now that doesn't mean that you perceive that you're less able to do it. It just means that the lights are on but nobody's home. Does that make sense? You actually aren't doing it so well. And somebody was giving me a great example after the talk yesterday. And so there's not surprising that actually taking caffeine significantly increases your risk of feeling stressed and certainly anxious. You're aware of that. I mean, it used to be listed in the DSM-4, but in the latest it's not. For reasons I don't know. Physiology hasn't changed. So let's just say you were, this is a potential stressor. Please provide an explanation of the following equation to the physics faculty. And this is Einstein-Infeld-Hoffmann equations of motion. Now, if we were to give that to somebody like Einstein, he would look at that and he'd go, what stress? He'd stand up here and he'd explain it all to you. Though he may look at this audience, he may look at me, and I remember there was a great quote from him once. Einstein gave many talks, as you know. He was particularly famous in his time. And he would give many public talks. And he had one lady who came up to him after one of his talks and said, Professor Einstein, could you please explain to me the special theory of relativity? And he looked at her and he said no. And the reason why he said no was not because he didn't want to. She asked him whether he could explain it to her. She didn't have any of the necessary background in order for her to understand a thing of what he would have to say. And so, no, he couldn't explain it to her. So he may stand up here and feel quite stressed because he's going, how am I going to get this group of people to understand this? But you might be geniuses too. So that might not be a stress for him. But it wouldn't be a stress for him to explain it to a physics faculty. If you've got a young physics genius, and all PhD students tend to think they are, they'd love it. What an opportunity. Good stress. They'd feel stressed, but it'd be good stress because they've got some of the tools that's necessary to solve the problem, correct? So it would stress them a little bit, but it's probably good stress. And then if you got somebody, and if they asked me to do it, particularly to the physics faculty, I would bumble through something like that. And I would feel pretty inadequate to actually present that to that faculty because I don't necessarily have the background to be able to give it an appropriate explanation. So it depends on what your resources are. So when we feel that a circumstance, a current or event demands or requires a response from us that we are not sure we can satisfactorily meet, then we feel stressed. And this might be getting to an appointment on time. I mean, not really a problem on the mid-north coast. I know there's 2 sets of lights in Maxville, and we lived up here for a couple of years, and you can miss both lights, mostly. So, except for the one down Woolies, that catches you. But usually not a stress getting anywhere on time. But in Sydney, absolutely. And we've been back living down there for a few months, and it's just, as I said, you just sit in traffic for no clear reason. I used to ride my push bike, actually, to and from the hospital, which was great because I could get home faster on my pushy 16 kilometres than what I could in my car. Family tension, obviously we know, not seeing eye to eye, disciplining, whatever it might be. When we feel that a circumstance requires a response from us that we're not sure we can satisfactorily meet, okay, so then we've got a stressor. Something is actually causing that stress. If you feel you can handle it, no stress. Don't feel you can handle it or may not, okay, now this is a potential stressor. As I said, people with trait anxiety may have a lower threshold. And you've got to be really careful for people who have that. Because, yes, I think there's ways in which they can improve that. But just don't write them off as somebody who's always stressed, somebody who's always hyper anxious. You know, relax with them. If I had recognised that for my wife, and she's not here in the audience today, but, you know, I do try and drive a lot more mindfully when she's in the car now. Sometimes I forget, but, you know, I know that there's little things that stress her. Like she'll have planned what lane to be in, where we're going. I kind of work it out as we get along, you know. Oh, we need to go left? Okay, we'll eventually get there. Whereas she will have made sure that she's in the left-hand lane and knows that within 2 kilometres she's got to be in the right-hand lane and, you know, slowing down to that. Well, so I try and do that more so that she feels less stressed. Then so there's the stressor, then there's our perception of what's required to meet the demand, so our assessment of it, our available resources, whatever we've got as mental resources, mental or physical resources, and then our assessment of whether we can meet the demand with the resources available. So we've got those 4 areas, and in those 4 areas we can actually make a difference. And I'll show you that there's some good spiritual things that touch. So here's an example, the stressor. This actually happened in Sydney. I think over a year ago now, but anyway, part of the house fell down. It was a new house. I don't know whether it was insured, but the point is that that was a significant stressor to begin with because they were in the house at the time. It happened at night, and the family was in the house, and you can just imagine what you would think. First of all, is everybody safe? And then second of all, who was the builder and how can I contact them fairly quickly? So obviously, big stress. Perception of the nature of stress, what's required to meet the demands? Well, it may be a considerable amount of money. It'll certainly be considerable inconvenience, especially these days. You've got to try and find a builder who can do it. Available physical and mental resources to meet the demand. Well, bank balance, loan, families, emotional resilience. You've got to go and live somewhere while this is being repaired. All of that kind of thing. Our assessment of whether or not we can meet those demands. Well, quite probably for most people, particularly if they've got a huge mortgage to get in there and they only just managed to do it. Now having all of this on top of it, depending on what their insurance is again, that may be very inadequate. So that would be a big stress. If we look at something else and we'd built a sandcastle and the tide starts coming in, we probably wouldn't think that was much of a stress. In fact, very little. In fact, nothing was required in order for us to do anything about that and more than adequate resources. It's not something we would have to worry about at all. It's just not a stress. Our sandcastle's going. All right. So it really is our perception, what value we place on whatever it is we're dealing with. So most causes of stress are non-life threatening, that's true, still challenging on a regular basis, and these are the things that are very typical to all of us. It might be money, bills, work, relationships, family, ill health for different reasons. And let me just add to that. When people are stressed, it does promote ill health in joints because, as I said, chronic stress actually produces an inflammatory physiology, and so ultimately that can damage things like joints, can certainly make it a little bit easier to tear a ligament, tendon, muscle, and feel, unfortunately, in that cycle of feeling ill health. People who already have ill health also reduces their resilience as well. So creating regular but lower levels of stress responses. Very quickly, we did see this the other day, so I'll step through it relatively quickly. I'll mention it through in a couple of ways. But as we know, the amygdala and referencing through to the prefrontal cortex, remember I talk about that a few times, and I just referenced caffeine does affect it. In fact, somebody showed me the other day that there's some evidence that Freud would not join some of his colleagues in a discussion where they were using caffeine because he didn't like the way that it actually reduced his ability to think clearly. Now he used his brain a lot, and I think he was a brilliant man. Of course, I think psychology and certainly society has moved a fair way from Freud and his ideas now. But at the same time, he was very aware that he wasn't thinking clearly when he actually took caffeine. It makes sense. He wouldn't have known anything about it reducing blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, but it certainly happens. So within the context of stress and anxiety, you get all of this kind of thing happening where you do get the stress hormones, things like cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, etc. So we have the demand. We have the brain processing that, being in the frontal lobe with the amygdala, referencing backwards and forwards, ultimately sends through signals. The hypothalamus can switch on the the sympathetic nervous system, producing some of, and also the different hormones. We won't go into details there. But ultimately you end up with that fight or flight. If you're chronically stressed, you're getting that all the time, but the body adapts to that cortisol and to even the adrenaline, noradrenaline. But unfortunately, it creates immune suppression along with some damage which creates its own localized inflammatory activity, and as I mentioned, particularly in blood vessels. So classic fight and flight produces cortisol, sympathetic nervous system, activation of the adrenals. When the body experiences chronic stress, as I've just mentioned, the body becomes insensitive and resulting in that hyperinflammatory state. And I should have mentioned, yes, your blood glucose goes up significantly because cortisol actually keeps pushing that up. Remember, when you're stressed, it is actually like putting your foot on the accelerator as well. The body's actually pushing you metabolically so that you are actually running harder. So the body metabolically is running harder. And in the same way that you can wear out a car, even a young one, by having the foot constantly down, you'll do the same thing with a human. Again, why nutrition is so important in that. All right, heart rate, blood pressure increases, digestion slowed or inhibited. Now that's actually often when people do eat, and I'll often not eat if I'm giving a talk, even a Sabbath afternoon talk or something like that. My wife, and if you've seen her, she's quite petite, but she actually loves food. And that's the first thing she'll want to do after, of course, the service, is check and see out what they've got for Sabbath lunch. And she's keen for me to be right there with her, but the trouble is, it's better for me not to eat because I'm not going to digest it. I'll just end up with a major stomach ache if I try and do that. But digestion is slowed even if you are particularly chronically stressed. Liver increases its production of glucose, as we mentioned, that's a cortisol effect. Constriction of blood vessels, many parts of the body. If you're constricting blood vessels, what's happening to your blood pressure? It definitely is going to go up. It's just like trying to put water through. You put it through a big pipe and it's a nice, easy trickle out the other side. You narrow that pipe with the same amount of water going through and you start getting a jet at the other end. I mean, that's what we do with the end of our hoses and our spray hose. Well, that's exactly what happens with the body. And what is the problem with having high blood pressure? You start to pop things. You pop them in the brain, and if you've ever seen, and if I thought that I was going to say this, I would just throw up a little slide where you could actually see just the blood vessels. It's a little bit macabre, but on some people who have donated their bodies to science, they can actually put a certain, it's like a jelly type substance through into all the blood vessels, and then they dissolve the rest of the body away, and so you're just left with the blood vessel network. And the brain is absolutely incredible, the amount of networks there. Also the kidneys, also the lungs. And you can see when people's blood pressure go up, where do they start to pop things and damage things? In the brain, certainly in the kidneys, and certainly also in the lungs. You also in the back of the eye also, which has got very small blood vessels. But you will pop things. You really don't want to have high blood pressure. Increases the risk of coagulation, and of course coagulation in the body in a number of different organ systems is not great, is it? Particularly the coronary arteries, but also the brain and the lung. Reduces the immune activity, so yes, you're more at risk of infection, particularly viral infections and things of that nature. A whole lot of inflammatory cytokines go up. This is just the immune system that's getting switched on in different parts of the body. And we often talk about the immune system as being kind of one thing. The immune system is, well, it's much more complex than what we would call our defense forces. But you've got Army, Navy, who else do we have? Army, Navy, Air Force at the very least, and then some specialist groups within there. Well, the body's immune system is actually much more complex than that, but it's probably a reasonable analogy. Reduced sleep quality for reasons we've talked about, and that really is a recipe for sickness. So can it cause disease? So we know it'll make you sick. You probably come down with viral infections much more easily, etc., but certainly can increase obesity. Cortisol itself increases fat deposition, and particularly visceral fat, and particularly around the belly fat, and particularly around the organs, the liver, etc. And it's interesting, well, When you're stressed, you eat ice cream, cake and chocolate, and you do, because these actually give you a little high. That's why we call them comfort foods. They're not good for the body at all, ever, but they do make you feel good, and this is just a little joke because stress spelled backwards is desserts. And it's true, you've probably all seen it. But in any case, when you are stressed, you do want more of that because it actually does give you a little bit of a high. But as far as possible, work to resist that, because most of these, like any kind of, if you like, drug, it always takes more than it gives. So yeah, you do get a little bit. That's why people do take them. But you actually end up paying more than what you're actually getting. And I'll just mention in here, of course, that stress is one of those things that increase that, and exercise is a great way of being able to reduce it. So stress increases the risk of disease. Yes, obesity we know. Heart disease it certainly puts up. Now we know that it can actually increase. So 2 reasons why your cholesterol will go up. One of them is particularly high saturated fats, and the other one is actually stress. So the liver will actually produce it. So you will actually put that for both. And your triglycerides will go up at the same time. That's a lot to do with things like insulin. And you do get inflammation and oxidative stress. And you can be, you can be non-obese and have significant vascular disease. We've tested a number of people over a number of years. And the one that I can remember, well, there's a few people, some that you would classically think, look, the results are going to be bad and we need to send you off fairly quickly. And we'll refer them to the appropriate specialist. But I have seen people who are, you wouldn't have imagined that they would have actually had vascular disease. But on our testing, they actually look like they could be significantly at risk. So it's worth getting a check. Diabetes we know about. Again, that's just increasing some of the resistance. High sugars and fats will do that. Gastrointestinal problems we know about. Depression. Now, the link between depression, anxiety, and stress is also quite strong. And one of the reasons why we think for that is depression gets you into a certain state, and there is a certain neurological state that develops. And you do lose certain synaptic activity, hippocampus reduces. Your ability to think, the frontal lobes, what we call processing speed, significantly reduces. And there is a link definitely through to stress and anxiety in the development of depression. But there is also strong lifestyle connections to that as well. In other words, how resilient you are. And Alzheimer's, as I mentioned earlier, there is a number of literature that actually shows there is a potential link with stress and the development of neurodegeneratives in both men and women. So how does it affect you emotionally, psychologically? Chronic stress increases metabolic demands on the brain and body, as I mentioned. And over time, it results in poor mental performance. As I said, your processing speed reduces. So you may still have good frontal lobe clarity, but the ability of the brain to actually access that information and reference backwards and forwards goes slower. And it's interesting, even when people have, if they've had depression and it's been treated successfully, either through CBT or other means, processing speed often is still reduced. We've got some of the techniques that we're working on that we have taken from University of California, San Francisco, where we can actually train the processing speed and hopefully increase that. But I think we need to connect that with some lifestyle changes to get the best results. And I thought this was good. I haven't lost my mind. I just can't remember where I left it. And true enough, and a lot of people feel that way. So how do we reduce stress and anxiety? So we've got potentially 4 places. Doing something about the demand or the threat, then the way we process that, the stress hormones themselves, and then somehow the resilience of the body outside of even the stress hormones. So of course, if you can get rid of the demand, then you no longer have a problem. If you can actually look at the demand and go, okay, well, there is a threat there, but let me process. And I'm going to give you an example a little bit later on, where the way a person has processed an absolute, genuine, life-threatening threat and process it as pretty much nothing to worry about. All right, let's have a look. As far as possible, remove yourself or minimize the threat. Well, and there are things that we can do about that. We don't have to continually put ourselves in place where we are going to be stressed or anxious, if we can. We can educate the brain in regard to some of the importance of the magnitude of the threat, and this is where good cognitive behaviour therapy, or CBT, really comes to the fore. Or really just having some wise mentors or friends somewhere that just help us put this into perspective. It's not as bad as we thought it was, or not as bad as it could be. Or in the context of everything else, we don't need to worry about it as much. This is an important one, and as Christians, there is a reason why psychologically we've had an advantage over the rest of the population for a long time. I worry over a lot of some of our sort of recent assessments for this kind of thing that we are losing this advantage. And I believe the only way we lose it is when we actually lose that solid connection on the God of the Bible. Honestly, that's our Creator God. Not only is our Creator, He's our Redeemer. And He does know and care about everything that you do. One of the advantages, particularly as a scientist, and I was reflecting this to a friend of mine who's also a Christian and in the neurosciences, and was just saying, we have a privilege of looking at some of the detail of what our Creator can do. It is absolutely beyond genius. Absolutely beyond genius. And if you really understand that, there wouldn't be a person in the world that could say that this could come about by any, let's just say, incremental step, particularly of a random orientation. It is laughable. It is just not possible at all. In fact, just a very quick story. I had a colleague of mine, we were working on a particular pathway, and we had found what we call a positive allosteric modulator for a particular enzyme. And for those of you that took part in the NAD study, it was actually part of that NAD pathway. Anyway, we could see, and from our experiments, we could see that it actually increased the activity of this enzyme. But I didn't know where it bound, and I need to show that in order to be confident that it was doing what we thought it was going to do. So I brought in a colleague of mine who was a medicinal chemist. He was an Oxford boy, and a very bright fellow when it came to the actual chemistry. His chemistry was better than mine, and so we were looking at this pathway. I was showing him and we started modelling it using some of his sort of complex techniques, and we could actually model the enzyme with where the chemistry would be and where this would likely dock. And as part of it, and you could just see, as soon as something docks, you see that this protein just slightly shifts, click, and it'll do something else, and it'll take off another little section, a hydroxyl group or something. I know, it's probably boring you. It's just absolutely fascinating to me. Anyway, we followed this through for a little bit, and then I was just saying, it's amazing how you could just come about that by chance. Because, you've got thousands of amino acids that have to be in exactly the right sequence. And he goes, absolutely. And then I knew where I was taking him, and I said to him, but that's only one of part of this whole pathway. We've got a number of sequences that all need to fit together, because that goes to this, goes to that, goes to this. He gets down, he goes, yes. And then I said, and even the next one, yes, he looks at me, he goes, that's impossible. In terms of the evolutionary, because I'd said, is it amazing how evolution could do it? And he goes, no, that's impossible. And then he realizes what he said. His head comes up, he goes, I've got to go. And he left. He literally didn't talk to me for over a month. And we've always been on good terms, and after that he did. We never broached the topics in any depth, and that was just part of workload, time constraints. But, it is not something that anybody who looks at it depth will see. And the point of just saying that is, this is the God that we serve. This is the God that we can trust. And ultimately, if He's got that amount of knowledge, and He said that He actually knows you, knows even the hairs of your head, gets easier as we get older, but that's the point, that He actually knows all of that and can deal with it. So we can remember when He says a few things, cast all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. We don't necessarily have to feel that, but let's act on it, because it will be true, and God won't let you down. That's His responsibility, not mine. Keep your lives free from, and that should be from, not form, the love of money, and be content with what you have, because God said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. My wife and I have had a little bit of an experience over the last 3 or so years, and it's interesting that we've said to ourselves in a number of occasions where our money is currently tucked away, invested, and we would like it not to be there. We'd like it to be in something a little bit more concrete, but we haven't found anything yet. And it's just interesting. I've said, Creels, we could actually lose everything, because the markets could crash. There's a lot of talk about this kind of thing. And if it does, well, I figure, God knows that too. And it's not like, as long as we're listening and he's not shouting and we're listening or facing the other way, we can certainly go forward in confidence. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Philippians 4:6. So working hard for something we don't care about, well, that's stress. And that's unfortunately what a lot of people have to do. And then you've got this one, but working hard for something we love is called passion. Doesn't mean it's not still has its level of impact on the body. It can do. But we're all going to be, I'm sorry to be morbid, but given another 40 or 50 years, looking at some people in the audience, maybe longer than that, but essentially, we'll all find our end, won't we? Either Christ comes back or ultimately we will be dead. Let's give ourselves to something worthwhile and give it 100%. Whatever we've got, let's give it to God. And God actually is perfect goodness. That's what we're giving it to. So when God is saying, those who refuse to love the truth, well, the truth is, as Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That is perfect goodness. We still don't understand what it was like for Christ to actually die on the cross for us. I mean, God becoming man forever. You don't get that, I don't get that, but that happened. And that's what God is asking us to give. 100% truthful. Give yourself to 100% truth, 100% selflessness. It's worth the passion. So Isaiah 26:3, you'll keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. This is the example I wanted to give you. The first Christian to be martyred in the Colosseum, around about 117 AD, was Saint Ignatius of Antioch. It's reported that when he was thrown to the lions, he exclaimed, I am as the grain of the field and must be ground by the teeth of the lions that I may become fit for his table. And look, I guess I wouldn't call it mythology, but I would call it, certainly the story around it was that he was able to, went in front of the lion without any fear. And as many of you will have read Fox's Book of Martyrs and many of the books of Christians, Christ followers who gave themselves completely to God in environments of tyranny and sadism often, and yet did it without fear. Now, what stress mitigating strategy did he have access to that enabled him to retain such presence of mind? And I want us just to reflect on that. He had every reason to be absolutely stressed, and yet he wasn't. And there are many people who have been placed in those situations, and I won't go through them, some of them are a little bit gory, but where death was the imminent end, and yet they could see themselves and take them through with dignity and certainly with faith. The brain processes the demand. His amygdala is firing off going, we've got a threat here, I think you need to run. But what happened when he fired through to the frontal lobe? His frontal lobe said, you just relax. We've got something bigger at stake. And I think we have that opportunity, and in Christ we can reach that. So the brain processes, yes, lots of stress hormones. These are great for short term, but bad for the long term. So the ways of reducing those stress and circulating stress hormones, well, yep, we can exercise. We talked about BDNF the other day. Galanin is another one. Great way of being able to keep ourselves healthy. I'm just going to leave it there. I won't say any more otherwise. And I'm sorry, look, I actually put coffee there. I didn't mean to go against coffee. I'm not against coffee. I'm only against caffeine. Well, only giving you the context. Caffeine has use. In fact, one of the metabolites of caffeine, apart from it being theobromine, is a thing called theophylline. Does anybody know what theophylline's used for? Yeah, dilating some of the airways. So if, for example, you had somebody who was having an asthma attack and you only had, now you would probably only have decaffeinated coffee, but if somebody else had coffee, you could actually give them some coffee and potentially they will metabolize that into theophylline and you could get some benefit. In fact, for young children, they'll actually, or for babies, they will actually give them more the upstream and let them metabolize it so theophylline doesn't come out so fast. Spend time in nature. Research has found strong evidence being exposed to natural environments and recovery from physiological stress and mental fatigue. It's extremely important. And part of the reason for that, I believe, is that nature is something where it is grand, particularly the beautiful parts of nature, and we have so much of it in Australia, and it's not something we have to worry about, but it is something that connects us, I believe, to our Maker. So spending more time in nature is great, and certainly this week is one of those blessed times of the year where we get that opportunity. Spending time meditating on God's Word. And of course, this is a meditation where we're actually asked, the biblical meditation is actually putting something in there. You know, there's an Eastern meditation which also can relax you, but it is actually shutting down the frontal lobes. And little caveat here, I've got a bit of a talk on this part of it, but it is very interesting that within the context of Eastern meditation and the practices there, that 80% of those people, particularly if they practice for a long period of time, will experience significant anxiety disorders. Simply because what's happening is, yes, you're shutting it down, a little bit like using alcohol to shut down the frontal lobes. You do feel relaxed as that because you're not thinking. But at the same time, something has to come, that has to resurface again. And your amygdala now, because you're practicing shutting down the frontal lobe, your amygdala, when it references to the frontal lobe going, should we be worried about this? The frontal lobe's not there to pay attention, and it's not strong enough to suppress that feeling. And so eventually it's like, and you wonder why you're so anxious. As I said, you will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, Isaiah 26:3. For the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. So Christian meditation, always stay active, never passive, always on a subject, which is God. Goal of Christian meditation comprises filling the mind with the word and works of God, meditating upon his greatness and matchless love. And it really, meditate on that. And I often think, honestly, we need more time in nature because that allows our minds to focus on these important topics. This is the God of the universe. I mean, the creator of this and everything else that goes on around us, the whole ecosystem that we have that enable us to survive. It is just beyond genius. I wish I could walk you through a hologram at the very least and show you some of the brilliance. I know when I talk, it just kind of gets boring and you end up going to sleep. But the point is, it is absolute genius when you see it. And this is the God. In Christian meditation, we look out of ourselves, Jesus the object of our thoughts, the supreme focus of our attention. We recognize that the heart is deceitful. Now, what is the heart? It's really the emotions. The emotions naturally are all selfish. They're self-oriented. And unfortunately, if you just follow according to that, which is a typical popular mantra in society, if you just follow that, you end up in a really damaged position. We recognize the heart is deceitful above all those, desperately wicked, and that there is no good thing in it. And there's the text. So key points, the mind, frontal cortex particularly, is kept active. The focus is away from self, and the focus is actually on Christ. And remember who Christ is. And that's actually been my prayer over the last, nearly a year now. I actually want to know Christ properly. Who actually is Christ? And that's why he's perfect goodness. He's all of those things. You know, you want to stand up for something that's worth fighting for. This is what's worth fighting for. That's what we stand up for. No matter what happens in society, that's what we stand up for. So stress hormones increase the body, cellular activity, as I mentioned. So in order to keep all of that activity of the body going, we need to keep feeding it so you can actually handle stress better, or you've got more resilience if you're looking after yourself better. We've talked about exercise reducing, but putting the right nutrition in there. If you put just fat and sugar in there, fat and sugar will definitely give you a little high. You will feel better. But guess what the body has to do with it? It's got to go and metabolize it. It's got to work with that and try and repair a lot of the damage that happens when you put it in there. And it happens after every meal. It's not just something that happens sometime in the future. It literally happens after every meal. So, and I've mentioned all of those before. Opportunity for repair, getting sleep, rest, we talked about that yesterday. Stimulating the body to work together, but in an unstressed state. Recreation. Stress is not always bad, so just giving that sort of rounding it out. You know, a little bit of stress, particularly within our ability area, and all of you have expertise in certain areas, and if you were given a task to do in those areas, it's nice to be kind of put on the spot to do something. But then if it gets too stressful, then of course you go over the hump and now it starts to become negative. So a little bit of stress is good. It's not good to never be put under pressure. It's one of the reasons why, and it's certainly been argued from a number of different angles, but when people retire, that's usually the most dangerous time of their lives. And it is not uncommon to see people deteriorate and unfortunately die fairly soon in their retirement because they no longer have as much of a focus and a cause to actually get themselves up every day and putting themselves under good stress. So a little bit of stress increases physical performance. Well, we know that up to a certain point can actually improve some of the immune function as well, but that's a mild stress that will do that. It's feeling like you've got something valuable to do and you've got to apply yourself, but not to the point where it's actually stressing you because you don't think you can actually do it. So good stress is good. Yep, child development, we know that. They need to be put under a little bit of stress. You don't want to take all the stresses away from them. The only exception, children of women who viewed their pregnancy as more negative than positive had slightly lower attention capacity for their children. But most women who were pregnant, who were under reasonable to moderate stress, it actually improved or showed benefits even in the children at 2 years of age. So little stress is good. Exposure to ongoing chronic stress, anxiety, bad, leads to disease. 4 areas in which we can look at modulating that. That's the stressor, try and remove ourselves from it. Number 2, the brain's interpretation of that. And again, that's putting it into context. The Bible helps us with that a lot. Good professional help, cognitive behaviour therapy can certainly do that. Circulating stress hormones, well, that's where we exercise. So sometimes we can't avoid the stress, but we can exercise and bring that stress down so we can reset that HPA axis. And then finally, the body's resilience to stress increases. So if you've got good nutrition, you've put good sleep habits, recreation, rest, the body is actually able to handle more of the stress that's being dealt. And the more stress that you get under, then the more important it is that you need to look after yourself. So I left those up there just in case you wanted to, any particular issues or prominent things that you need to discuss with people more professionally. As I said, the free online anxiety assessment is there. We've come to the end of our week. And as part of what we've been doing over the last 5 days is giving information which I hope you've been able to integrate in some kind of way so that you actually understand a little bit more about how to look after your body, how to look after yourself, health. What I would like to do now is actually invite you to make a commitment if possible. So if, as a result of the information that we've learned and other things that I'm sure you've integrated, by God's grace, if you're willing to actually do something, even just take a small step, so from today, tomorrow, you'll actually do something better to improve your health than you did today. If you're willing to do that, would you mind standing? It doesn't have to be a big step. It just needs to be something that you're doing better today than you did yesterday, better tomorrow than you're doing from today. And by God's grace, it will bring you into a place where not only are you able to be more, well, your life will actually be better, but by God's grace, we can do the work that God has actually called us to do better. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, Lord, we just thank you for this beautiful opportunity to be able to share together this week. We thank you for all of the resources that you've given us, the health, Lord, that you have provided for each one of us here, and the opportunities that we have, Lord, of being able to do something with all of the information that you've provided for us about how we can look after these bodies better in a way that we can glorify you. So I pray that you would bless each one here, Lord. Give them your spirit, give them your inspiration, give them clarity of thought, that they can go from here, Lord, and be more effective witnesses for you in the work that you have for them. And we pray this in the name of Jesus, our Saviour and Redeemer. Amen.